Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today's presentation is one piece of our larger series of expert sessions that are designed to bring our users of our IoT and AR products up to speed as quickly as possible. These sessions will cover a large set of topics, including design, development, deployment, maintenance, and tips, as well as new capabilities of our software that could benefit you and your customers. If you have questions during the presentation, you're more than welcome to type them into our Q&A box. We will be reviewing them live at the end of the presentation. If there is any question that cannot be answered live, we will share the answers later along with the recording of this session. So today for the session, we're going to cover flow. And with this flow expert session, you have myself, Anthony Maffa. I'm product manager for Flow, as well as a couple of ThingWorx items. And then Vinay Vaidya. Vinay is part of our R&D team, very involved in Flow, as well as Exida and ThingWorx. So what are we going to cover today? Well, this is a pretty powerful piece of our software. It's still being developed, meaning we're evolving it as we go forward here. And it is comprised of a lot of different pieces and parts. So we're going to do an overview of what we can do with this, show you some of the simple flows that you can create, some of the more complex flows that you can create, and give you ideas of some of the ways to make sure that customers use it as intended. Sometimes we have to be careful with software, just like with any tool. It may look like it is applicable to certain problems, but longer term, it may not work very well on those. So we'll talk about some of the capabilities and some of the limitations of Flow. So why are we doing this? Well, pretty much up front, best-in-class corporations are really trying to merge all of this information together. They want to take a look at a piece of equipment, and they want to get real-time data from that equipment, but it's also important for them to look at historical information that may not be in the IoT space. So for example, if you're servicing a piece of equipment and you'd like to know how many service visits have been performed on that piece of equipment, well, without Flow, you're actually going into your SAP or your Salesforce or your ServiceMax environment and looking that up. But with Flow, we can actually integrate that very quickly and pull that right into the forefront. This is a very common view of our world. We talk about the left to right, you know, travel or transverse of data, and we source that data. But the reality of where Flow falls into this is more in the orchestrate. In fact, the original name for Flow was orchestrate. So we want to pull everything together, just like an orchestra leader controls a whole group of musicians and has them play in time and in tempo. That's really what we're trying to do here. So as far as goes with Easy Connect, we've got that to quickly build these interactions and quickly build these data acquisition components or aggregation components. The nice part about this is you're not duplicating the data, you're just exposing that data. Now, if you look at the service or the life cycle of a product, going from left to right, we design and we manufacture, sell, we train people on how to use it, and then operate and maintain that. Now, there's actually some others in here, even like, for example, there's the distribution side of it. So if you have a really long time from, say, manufacturer to deploy it to the field, you might have to worry about monitoring during distribution. There's also a validation or a commissioning stage in certain environments. So all of those things, you really like to know what's going on. And again, looking at this from an end-to-end, we're using an IoT platform really to get everything and tie it all together. And Flow is just another piece of that integration, pulling that information in together so that my design material is available to those who are maintaining it, and my operating material is available to those who are designing the next generation products. There's an old saying that if I don't measure it, I can't improve it. And really, from an R&D perspective, very often once it gets into the manufacturing environment without an IoT environment in place, they don't get any data. So they just build off of what they think they need to do. Now, if I look at ThingWorx Flow and the integration side of this, we want to connect to an on-premise or a cloud-based enterprise system to pull data in. So if you look on the right-hand side, you're looking at the flow palette. And one of the things I want you to note is Salesforce is one of our connectors. But you'll notice within Salesforce that there are individual icons for things like creating an email template or creating a record or deleting a record. So as I drag those over, that is a very specific action. But not all of our interfaces work that way. Some of them are much more generic, and you will actually be doing an interface. For example, SAP BAPI interface has to be more specific about what you're doing. So we will have a single icon to drop on there, and we'll give you an example of how that works. But so I'll put these into compartmentalize these for you, that we have different ways that we'll actually do this. Different types of, and I'll bring those up in a minute. But before I do that, there are 3 different ways that we can actually trigger or start these flows off. All right. Now, that means really flow is not what I'd call an inline or in-process execution engine. So I would not put this in the process of data flowing in to try to do something with that data. We have other tools that are coming up in the future that will help in that need, but flow is really not intended for that. So if you look at what we're doing with flow, we're triggering, and we might use a timer or a schedule to run a flow. A lot of times, like for example, people do that today for weekly reports, right? You would just time that and schedule that out. You may be doing that here to pull or merge data from one system into another. System event, something that happens in the system that triggers, so a specific event or an alarm, and then a device itself event. So let's say that we have an over temperature or under pressure on a device, then we can trigger a flow out of that. We can invoke flows using webhooks. So use an external web application or an HTTP post to provide inputs. And then the last one is you can invoke flow as a service. I can use a ThingWorx service to programmatically invoke a flow, and then I have an input and output through that. Now, that when we do these, you'll know they're all triggered. I could be the trigger, right? So, for example, I could put a button onto a mashup, and that button could have a binary state of 0 or 1. And I might say, well, rather than always go to do something, always go grabbing data, maybe I only need it on demand, and I'll click that button and say, go get me a drawing or go get me a document. And by changing that button from a 0 to a 1, that may create an alert or an event that forces that. So there are different ways to create this, but the point is that we are doing this off of a trigger. We're executing off of some input and some change of state. Now, this is the part I was referring to a little bit earlier. Our connectors really have a couple of different flavors to them. Now, we have out-of-the-box system-specific connectors. So these are the SAP and the Salesforce Windchill, the Microsoft Office package, some Google Box. Those are APIs designed specifically to interface, and we have captured that capability within our product. Now, there are others which are standards based. So, for example, HTTP or OData, SOAP, Swagger, RAML, and SQL. Now, I could connect to SAP using the SAP connector. I could also, though, and it would be a lot more work to do this, but I could also use the SQL standards-based connector, and I could write a series of SQL commands to go get data as well. It's obviously easier with SAP than it is with SQL. Now, those two boxes there are standard, and they are included with the product. But we also have the ability to create custom connectors. So if a non-standard or non-standards-based connector is not in place, then they can be created. Now, the reason they're grayed out is currently in our environment, we will not host those. So that connector, if you were to create one for some other system that we don't have, your customers or our customers would have to host that in their own environment. That would not be hosted in a PTC cloud environment. So there's the obvious value to all this is that our customers and even their customers can get access to data. They can create these GUIs. They can create these user interfaces that are interactive and have a plethora of data in them from a variety of systems. So, I used to work at one point in a call center supporting the team and pulling this information together, and they would have 2 or 3 monitors in front of them, and on one monitor they had their Salesforce data, and in another monitor they had their SAP data, and in the third monitor they had their IoT data. And so now what we're saying is, no, I don't need 3 monitors. I'm going to pull the information specific to that asset into those. Now, I mean, the 3 monitors are nice, right, with the respect of I've got all my data there, but the real loss in that is that I have to go into 3 different systems and find the specific asset, whereas in this environment, we're pulling it all into one place for you. So as soon as you click on the device, you get the information that you need. The other nice part about it is it's easier to repurpose this. So you can literally take some of the flows that you have and reapply them in other environments. It's not necessarily like you've created something. For example, let's say that you hired an external company to create a third-party interface for you. That's a hard and fast interface. It will do some great things, but if you want to edit it, alter it, modify it, duplicate certain capabilities in different arenas, you have to rehire people to do that. You don't have to do that here. So that's a great advantage of this. With respect to how it's deployed, there's always been a lot of confusion about this. There's a couple different ways that you can get access to Flow. Within the SCO or SCP Enterprise editions of ThingWorx, you will get a Flow instance in those cases. All right. If you are looking at ThingWorx Navigate, then there is a download entitlement, no license, that includes Flow. And the part numbers are right here. So you guys will actually get a copy of these slides later so you can see that. And then there's also in an Azure only environment, ThingWorx Azure Services, we have Flow out of the box capabilities included in that, in the service cost for that. So let's look at a really simple flow, right? And this isn't flow per se, but this is the flow of data that we care about. And we have an asset, and if that asset creates an alert, we'd like to identify what that asset is that sent the alert, and then determine a path of activity. Maybe that is a high temperature, or maybe it is a low fuel alert. Each one of those has a separate path. And that separate path would go to Salesforce, and it would schedule a service or create a urgent service order, say in this case, deliver that information to people, whether it is through a cellular text messaging or through an email. It actually could be a combination of both. You can cascade and do both and end. So this is the classic example that we've always shown everyone in the very beginning. And as I noted before, you have all of your Salesforce options over here. So we would actually drag these over and start wiring them up. Now, we do not auto-populate data, so you still have to tell what trigger I'm going to do and what properties I need to get and what I want to pass on under the individual conditions. But still, very clean, very simple to do. In the case of the 10% less, or less than 10% of the fuel remaining, we're going to open up a refuel ticket, and then we will send that to the operator via an email. Or in the case, say, of an emergency, let's say the temperature gets too high, we would actually send the local operator a notification on cell, a text message that maybe they need to shut the engine down. Now, in theory, if that engine were connected to an IoT interface directly and we had controls, access to the controls, there's no doubt that you could send a command back to that device and control it. I'm not too sure many people would allow us to do that, but again, the realm of possible versus what will actually be permitted to do. So I just kind of walked you through those. We would do these, set it up, and obviously have the ability to implement that. Now, there's a video in here. I'm not going to run the whole video. I will just say that it's there for reference for later. You can take a look at it. It basically walks through the process of creating this specific flow and how we would link it up, and even the wiring that goes on in the individual areas. So you've got that. You've got the way to do it. There's so much stuff to cover right now. I'm just going to let that one go by, and we're going to go to the next slide here. So that was an example of a service example, but what are you going to do? Say I've created a drawing, and maybe I've got the intellectual property for that drawing, but I don't have the manufacturing capabilities for that. I might need to rely on a vendor to do that. So upon release, I see a state change. There's my trigger. I would really subscribe to the state change of a device. When I see that, then I get the PLM info, and I would do a default case of add that part to a newly released list. But in the case where I needed it manufactured, maybe I need to upload that drawing file. Excuse me. Maybe I need to upload the drawing file and send my supplier a note that I would like them to quote for that newly released part. I may even need to send it to multiple suppliers, and that can be done as well. So this really kind of shortens that process, right? I don't have to worry about looking in a folder. When is it released? When will it get released? Maybe it gets released at 4:55 on a Friday, and I've already left, and we're under a rush. I come in Monday, realize I just missed the whole weekend. So this can go out immediately. This is automatically fired upon the release of that product. They get the drawings, they get the email, produce that for me. Now, let's talk about SAP BAPI. The two that I just showed are really pretty straightforward. I had everything laid out for me. I just had to drag over the function that I wanted and tie it together. But the BAPI, or the Business Application Protocol interface that SAP has, excuse me, I had to take a drink there for a second. This interface is a little more open-ended. So as you'll see, this one's a video as well. As you'll see, when we drop the BAPI interface in and I start to tell it what I want to do, I actually have to be specific about what I want to do. There is nothing in here that says, here's all the list of stuff that you have. So in fact, you'll notice it says, okay, well, I'm going to go read the reference table, but I didn't give it enough information. So it's going to ask me for at least 3 characters to fill in to try to find something here. So we know we're doing something with respect to material. Now it's going to come back with a list. And that list is going to include everything that has the word material in it. Doesn't have to be the start or the end, it just includes the word material. So from that, I can pick the call that I would like to have. So I want to do my material get all. And we have now a list of all the fields that have to be put in. There's a highlight for each one to tell you that only one of them in here is the material one, is one that is required. Everything else you'll have noticed on here is not required. You can add it. It'll filter down the list, but you do not have to have it. One of the things that I would note is, I'll go back here a little bit, within this environment, you can do this in the form, or you can, as we changed it in 9.0, you can actually assign JSON to this. So if you know exactly what you want to write, you can put the JSON code right in. You do not have to rely on the form, but the form obviously makes it easy. Everything that's in the BAPI interface will be pulled up, and you will be given the fields automatically. So instead of giving you maybe 200 or 300 or 500 individual icons to pull on with SAP, we're pulling one on. You at least need to know something about the interface in order to make this work. Once I've done that, in this particular case, we're doing just a simple, just to show the example, we're going to log the details. So we ask for the request, we tell it, oh, by the way, I would like to look at the plant data. So I want to drive the plant data into the log. And now upon execution, whatever triggers that, I can go get my material and pull in the information for the plant for that. And you'll see as it goes through, we've executed it. It goes to get all material. And then we do get information coming out of that. And that information that's specifically tied to the plant is then going to be in the logger. And there's your information that's tied to the plant. So very simple case, but extremely, extremely powerful interface using SAPs and the BAPI interface. And then another one that we can do, and this is very much another one of the open environments, is an HTTP action, right? Where I can do an HTTP request, similar, but this is a standard protocol, right? So you even have to know more. You need to know more about what it is that you want to do, which, for example, what URL are you going to? What is your username and password? Are you using encryption? So it's a little more complex in terms of the configuration and setup than, say, doing a Salesforce or ServiceMax interface where everything is pretty much laid out for you. But we wanted to show you the flexibility and the capabilities that are within Flow. It's not just limited to that Salesforce interface. It has all of these capabilities built into it. So we can use commercial off-the-shelf protocols like HTTP and, like we said, like Swagger, and you can use those to interface and build your own type of interfaces. You do not have to rely on anything that's currently in the software in terms of Hardcast, Salesforce, and ServiceMax and such. So these videos are in here. They're pretty straightforward. They're short. They're not going to enlighten you to the point of, wow, I got a great way I can use this to solve this problem. But they will certainly help you understand the vast capabilities of the software. So let's go a little further even. Let's talk about the possibilities that we have within our software. Now, when we purchased Onshape about 18 months ago, there was some activity within the Onshape environment to start to obviously integrate it within our Windchill environment. And Moritz and Steve Dertine and team, they said, wow, this is pretty cool. We can do some really nice stuff, and we can use Flow to kind of be that link between the two. So they said, well, if we were to publish a bill of materials from Onshape and we wanted to put it into Windchill and have all of our 3D realizations in there, and then we want to create or update parts and structures in accordance to what we see in the BOM in Onshape. So they're basically taking that process of creating a bill of materials, taking those 3D drawings, all of that, and using Flow to drive it into Windchill and create an instance in Windchill. Now, I know that this is going from right to left. Unfortunately, the flow in here is really coming from left to right. We are conventional with that, so we're not driving in the backside here and going out. So the flow, if you follow it, really goes from here. We're doing our things in Onshape and then going into Windchill. Now, this is a very complex program that they put into place. And this is why I wanted to bring it up, because Flow has the ability to do some very detailed and cascading, as well as calling other flows. So it does not have to be all on one sheet of paper. In this particular flow environment, we're going from Onshape to Windchill with the bill of materials and the geometry publishing. There are approximately 80 actions in this. And you can see there's a lot in here. And they are calling subflows. So they have things that they're doing here where they might have to call another flow. That's actually this is where I was talking about maybe reusing flows. So if you have an activity that you would do all the time, you can literally create a subflow and have that flow called from within a different flow. So in their case, they're saying, well, if I need to get a bill of materials, that's a thing I do all the time. Let's create a subflow. Or if I want to publish that bill of materials, or I want to pull that geometry out, I can create subflows to do those components. And then if I need to do it again, if I need to fix the flow itself, the subflow, I can maintain those flows independently. I'm not looking at one gigantic flow and having to fix half a dozen of them. So what that ends up happening in Windchill is they've taken that, it created the parts, it created or updated the 3D representations for those parts, and it's all dependent on what you're doing here, right? It can add source URL to the parts and allows you to trace them back to the status in Onshape, so I can see what happens if it changes in Onshape. And then it creates or updates those part structures with positioning components. Now, the result of this is obviously straightforward, right? I have a bill of materials and I have a mock-up structure that is now interjected into Windchill. And then obviously that can drive things like a manufacturing process. But the nice part about this now is that I have an Onshape product, which is PTC owned, which is literally integrated into Windchill. Then they did a little more work with this. They did some assembly and geometry publishing. There's about 65 actions that are rolled into this. And again, you can see some subroutines or really subflows that are called out of this. Now, that particular one, again, 65 or so actions that are in there, it creates and updates the Part Studio, and it's using, based on Creo or imported geometry. It adds part numbers, it adds names and attributes to those imported parts. This, though, doesn't add the source URL or the info like we did in the previous flow. Okay. So broad range of things that we can do with flow. Now that everybody's head spinning, let's talk about some of the things that are really important from a best practices perspective. Because what we don't want is, I'm a mechanical engineer by degree, right? And there's this old saying, obviously I can use a wrench as a hammer, but the right tool is always the preferred tool. So let's talk about this, about using ThingWorx Flow as the tool that we intended it to be. We absolutely expect that flows are short-lived. These are not things that happen and continue in states for minutes, hours, days. That's not their intended. These are really supposed to be very quick executing. In fact, we default a 5-minute timeout, so if the flow does not execute within, say, 5 minutes, 300 seconds, it gets shut down. These are really about doing business processes, right? And think about, for example, anything that would happen where maybe a handoff to another person or waiting for something, and I'm waiting to be queued to do something. All of those types of things, we want to shorten that cycle time down. Now, flows are stateless. In other words, they do not have a change in their state of their in process to operating to waiting to executing to complete it. No, they either are started and complete it, or they've started and they've failed. That's it. There's no other states that we put into this. Now, that means that there are limitations to what I can do to this. So for example, I wouldn't run a flow and then say, well, I need to wait for Vinay to tell me it's okay to do the next thing. I guess in theory you could do that, but again, there's a 5-minute timer, so Vinay and I better be pretty well synced up in order for that to happen. And this is really, if a lot of people will compare this to, say, an ETL solution. It's really not an ETL solution overall. This is really, again, a stateless, on-demand or by exception transacting environment. So what does that mean? And again, I'm not going to read this word for word. I will give this to you you'll have this in here for a reference. Ideally, asynchronous, these are automated processes. Synchronous means I'm waiting in series for something. Asynchronous means it fires off and it doesn't care about anything else. So that means that if I call a subroutine or I call a subflow, the subflow is not going to wait, or the main flow is not going to wait for the subflow to complete. The two of them are going to happen at the same time, right? So that's a very big distinction to understand. And these systems they're loosely coupled, and I'll use loosely in quotations because, quite frankly, we do see, obviously, in the case that the Onshape, where we are updating and creating bombs and such, those are pretty tightly coupled. They're reacting to one another in a way, and they are linked so that if one changes, the other gets the information. But loosely in the aspect of we're not waiting for the other one to reply back. They don't exchange data in a sequential format, like, for example, maybe a protocol would use in a serial protocol where they send back data back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. This is an exchange that comes from one to the other. Again, multiple systems being used, but not a ton of data. Now, the middle column originally said maybe, maybe so, right? But this is really design dependent. These are real-time applications with rapidly changing data. Yeah, we're not too well positioned to do that. We have a customer right now that wants to try to use Flow in line with thousands of points of data coming in. And while Flow can handle a lot of data, it can handle a lot of flows simultaneously. It is not intended, again, as an inline processing engine for everything. So we often say when large amounts of data need to be exchanged, that may not be ideal for this, but large is relative. So if, for example, you're moving a 1 megabyte or a 1 gigabyte file and bringing that information in, when on demand, I'm pulling up a document, for example, and I want to see 3D images. That's a lot of data, but it's a one-time request. However, if I'm doing 10,000 requests every minute for 50 bytes of data, that's actually a larger load on the system than the 1 gigabyte data. So that's when we say large amounts. Large amounts really means volumetric more in terms of the number of transactions that we're doing. Now, we really do not want to use this when it's high volume data and streams and reams of data. That's not what we want to use. Or state-based, stateful long running flows. You're more inclined in that time frame and in that type of activity to really use a direct interface, like get an API or a database thing and ThingWorx, because Flow is just not going to work properly in that environment. So this is what I was talking about with an interrupted flow. A flow may populate a mashup, and then within that mashup, I might request something. Again, as I was saying earlier, I can set up a button on that flow on that mashup to instantiate a different flow to happen. But the mashup shouldn't be sitting there waiting. That should be just saying, hey, I would like to run this flow because maybe I need to go get additional data. I might, for example, decide that certain data takes too long to get. Maybe I don't always need third or three-dimensional data when I'm doing my review, so I might put that as an option on here, right? But in this case, if there were human steps in here, they can't be directly incorporated into Flow 1 where it says wait for Anthony to reply, but they can be cascaded like this. And then in the current flow behavior, again, because they're expected to really complete within minutes of being instantiated, and they are stateless, what we would do in a lot of cases is if you wanted to have multiple flows that relied on one another, then you have to think about cascading those. So for example, if I created an event and it caused me to react, so the flow sends a notice to me to do something, I can do my thing, and my thing might trigger another flow, which then would say call Vinay and send Vinay a request to do something, and then that might trigger it and go to someone else like Denise. That is very structured, and you have to think that out and you have to lay that out. So that's really what we're saying here is you could do that, but it is absolutely user intensive to do that kind of work. So you got to be careful about how you present flow. Yes, we can do some of this, but I'm not sure I would want to use it in a case, for example, maybe where a dozen people need to sign off on a drawing, and we want to know if that's been completed, because that is a very difficult flow to try to recreate. So let's talk real quick some high-level items that we've done, enhancements that were done to the product. 9 and 9.1 are out, but from a hosted environment, not many people have seen the 9 or 9.1 because we haven't deployed those into our own hosting environment yet. So we should be seeing those later in January, I want to say. So we should be looking like mid to late January for those. So delegated authorization. Important thing to have in the flow environment. Originally, we were on a user-based, so I had to have a set of credentials to access the data. You can still do that. However, we can use delegated authorization, which would take my credentials that I used to log into ThingWorx or into Flow to give me access to information. The nice part about that is I only get access to the data that I need to get access to. So if we're worried about people getting access to things that they shouldn't be seeing because it came in effectively as a super user or an administrator, then we would use a delegated authorization. Parameterized connections. The nice part about this, when we start to get into copying from a dev machine into a production machine, maybe my Salesforce or my SAP instance are different, which I would expect, right? I have a dev instance of SAP, and then when I go to production, I have a completely new instance of SAP. Well, in doing that, with having these parameterized connections, the nice part about it is we can say, well, we want to use this connection in this environment, we want to use this connection in this environment. And it's obviously a similar reverse that approach is, what about if I have two different plants and they're both using the same thing? Well, plant 1 versus plant 2, I can have both of those changed and say, well, plant 1, you're pointing to this, plant 2, you're pointing to the same thing. So that's what we're doing on the parameterized connection side. The next item we have here is flexible forms. I brought this up earlier. I made the note that in the forms, if you want to, you can go to the JSON input, and you saw on the BAPI interface too that we can start to enter information in about that. But in this case, what we're really talking about is you can substitute our GUI, our straight form, for adding JSON in. And the nice part about that is if you already have it coded out, great, drop it in. You don't have to even read through the form. You can go down that path. And then general SQL support. I know I was saying earlier that with the SQL connections that we have, you literally could touch almost any database and grab data. Now you have to know a little bit about the architecture in order to go grab this data. But the point is, you can do it and you can get to almost any database. So for folks that have created their own, maybe customer relation database or ERP even, or they can do that. They can talk to Oracle or Postgres or SQL, and they can pull that information out using their straight SQL connections. Now in 9.1, There was a lot of security work that went on, not because the product was insecure, but because there were a lot of changes that occurred, vulnerabilities that were identified. So we did updates on that. But there was a major change and enhancements that we made, and that was to performance metrics that we put together for Flow. We were asked some questions about what would we like to do with Flow, and should we add this connector, add that connector? And the challenge that we had is we had no data to know and to understand what was going on with Flow. So we're going to leverage the phone home portion of this. And by the way, obviously, because 9.1 has not been officially spun up in hosting yet, you won't see any of this, and you won't have access to this data. But we're actually capturing performance statistics on these flows. So we're going to tell you how many flows are in the environment that you have and the execution of those flows. So for example, in here, this is the ones that are in red are ones that failed. The ones that are in blue are the ones that succeeded. And there's a little filter up here that I can click on, and that filter will allow me to say, ooh, I want to see all data, or I want to see specific data. For example, we've broken it into PTC connectors and others. Down here is actually giving me an idea of the average, the minimum and the maximum times that these flows are operating in. So it gives, you could really get down to individual flows, and we'll understand and we'll identify which flows are running and which ones aren't. So we'll know which ones are there, which ones aren't there, running wise, which ones are successful, which ones are the problem child. Maybe they're consuming too much of our CPU and frequently failing. So really good data out of this. The nice part about this is for those who are in a service environment or a support environment, they'll actually be able to really assign a dollar value to this, right? So when they get flows up and running and they see that they're running a specific flow a certain number of times every day or week or month, that actually amounts to a savings for them because somebody's not doing that. So if it took 5 minutes for me to do that, and I do, let's say it's 1,000 times that flow is run in a month, well, that's 5,000 minutes that you just saved, and you can put a dollar figure on that. So it is a way to eventually provide people a kind of a payback or a return on investment calculator, and that is, believe it or not, that is a day-to-day problem that customers and users of systems have, because we always say, we buy a piece of equipment or a piece of software, we deploy it, and we can tell people it's being used, but it's often, well, what is it saving me, and how do I know that? So it's a great tool from a performance perspective. We can look at it, understand what's going on, see who's using what connectors, and our customers really can see that they're getting value out of the system. So that's pretty much the list of all the items that we have. I forgot to put questions on here, but let's open it up for questions, and let's see where we go from here. Denise or Vinay? Let's see.